The year is 1861, and the United States stands on the brink of collapse. Tensions simmering for decades have finally erupted into open conflict, the American Civil War. The causes were deep and complex, rooted in fundamental economic disparities between the industrialized North and the agricultural South. In the South, vast landowners relied heavily on the labor of enslaved black people to sustain their cotton-based economy. Their primary income came from exporting cotton and other agricultural goods, leading them to advocate for free trade and low tariffs. In contrast, Northern industrialists primarily catered to domestic demand, making a protectionist economic policy with high protective tariffs advantageous for them. These opposing interests became increasingly apparent as the U.S. expanded westward, and demographic changes gave the North a growing advantage. Southern politicians sought to preserve their power by insisting that slavery be introduced in new territories, which sparked the abolitionist movement advocating for the nationwide abolition of slavery. Although initially dismissed as extremists by most Northern politicians, abolitionist arguments gradually gained traction in discussions about the future of the U.S. This, in turn, drove many Southern politicians to adopt the arguments of extremists who advocated for secession and the creation of a new confederacy where slavery would be preserved. Tensions, significantly fueled by the U.S. victory in the Mexican-American War, escalated into armed conflicts between abolitionists and pro-slavery factions in the new Western territories in the late 1850s. This led to the formation of the Republican Party, initially composed of extreme abolitionists and left-wing radicals, but gradually attracting all Northern politicians dissatisfied with the status quo. One such figure was Abraham Lincoln, who, as the Republican candidate, was elected President of the U.S. in 1860. In the 1860 presidential election, Republicans, led by Lincoln, opposed the expansion of slavery into U.S. territories. Lincoln won the election, but before his inauguration on March 4, 1861, 7 slave states, whose economies were based on cotton cultivation, formed the Confederacy. The first 6 states to secede had the largest proportion of enslaved people in their populations, totaling 48.8%. Outgoing Democratic President James Buchanan and the incoming Republicans deemed secession illegal. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln declared that his administration would not initiate civil war. The 8 remaining slave states rejected calls for secession. Confederate soldiers seized numerous federal forts within territories claimed by the Confederacy. No compromise was reached at a peace conference, and both sides began preparing for war. The Confederacy assumed that European nations were so dependent on cotton production that they would intervene on their behalf. None did, and none recognized the new Confederate States of America. Lincoln's election served as the immediate trigger for South Carolina, dominated by extreme secessionists, to declare its secession from the U.S. in late 1860. Several other states joined, forming the Confederacy, led by former Federal Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. At the time, President Buchanan's term was expiring. As a member of the largely pro-slavery and pro-Southern Democratic Party, he did nothing to prevent the dissolution of the Union or the takeover of military and other federal installations by the seceding states. Among the few remaining federal strongholds was Fort Sumter, a fortress defending access to Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Shortly after Lincoln took office, extreme secessionists attacked Fort Sumter, forcing its garrison to surrender. This escalation of the political crisis into armed conflict prompted Lincoln to declare the secessionists rebels and issue a call for mobilization to suppress the rebellion, which was de facto a declaration of war. Until that moment, it was widely believed that the conflict would be resolved peacefully, either by the North allowing the South to secede and continue its way of life, or by concessions compelling the secessionists to change their minds, especially since a number of slave states either remained loyal to the Union or chose to await further developments. However, the declaration of war forced all states to take sides. Some of the so-called border states aligned with the South after Lincoln's announcement, including Virginia, which bordered the capital, Washington. Initially, both sides, especially the South, believed the war would be brief, ending after one decisive battle. However, it soon became clear that the warring factions were simply not capable of such a swift resolution. Before the war, the U.S. had a small professional army. Most of it remained loyal to the Union, while a smaller portion, particularly the best and most capable officers, defected to the South. These professional forces were quickly absorbed into inexperienced volunteer militias, which, especially in the North, were commanded by officers appointed for political rather than professional reasons. Similarly, Even professional officers used tactics learned from Jomini's Napoleonic-era textbooks, disregarding the rapid development of firearms and the increased speed, range, and accuracy that made battles far bloodier than previous conflicts. All of this became evident in the first major battle at Bull Run, Manassas, which ended in a Southern victory, but after which the victorious army could not march on Washington and force the North's surrender. Meanwhile, the North initiated a naval blockade and a campaign to capture Southern ports, which would eventually lead to the Confederacy's economic exhaustion. In the Western theater, the Northerners had more success, especially when General Grant began gradually occupying the strategically crucial Mississippi Valley, inflicting the South's first significant defeat in the bloody Battle of Shiloh in the spring of 1862, when he ordered a retreat from the very approaches of the Confederate capital. General Lee, who at that time became the commander of the Southern forces, believed that the South could not win a war fought on its own territory, and that it was necessary to launch an offensive into the North to force the Union to seek peace. The first such attempt in September 1862 led to the bloody Battle of Antietam. Although its tactical outcome was inconclusive, Lincoln declared it a Union victory and used it as an opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which de facto abolished slavery in all Confederate-held territories under Northern occupation. This proclamation fundamentally changed how the war was viewed by global public opinion. Initially, it was seen as a purely constitutional dispute, with many sympathizing with the weaker South and acknowledging its right to independence. However, once the abolition of slavery was stated as one of the Northern war aims, support for the South rapidly waned, especially in the United Kingdom and France, whose governments had previously considered mediation or even military intervention on behalf of the South. After two unsuccessful Northern offensives in Virginia, Lee once again attempted an invasion of the North in mid-1863. This led to the Battle of Gettysburg, where the South suffered a crushing defeat. Almost on the same day, Grant captured Vicksburg, placing the entire course of the Mississippi River under Northern control and cutting the Confederacy in half. After this, it became clear to everyone that, objectively speaking, the war could only end in a Southern defeat. However, the government in Richmond continued the fight, believing that inconceivably high casualties would make the war unpopular among voters in the Northern states, forcing them to turn their backs on Lincoln in the 1864 presidential election and support the Democrats, whose candidate McClellan advocated for peace negotiations, including the option for the South to amicably leave the Union. These hopes were briefly justified after Grant's spectacular offensive in Virginia in the spring of 1864 led to heavy casualties in Northern ranks and degenerated into a trench warfare stalemate outside Richmond. But in the Western theater, Northern General Sherman successfully broke through Southern lines, advanced into Georgia, captured Atlanta, and began the infamous Sherman's March, during which the states of Georgia and South Carolina were devastated, and the Confederacy deprived of its key agricultural and other resources. Lincoln was re-elected president, and Southern ranks began to suffer from hunger and shortages of all possible supplies. The end of the war was only a matter of time. In the spring of 1865, the Southern lines before Richmond were breached, and the city soon fell into Northern hands, effectively ending the Confederate government. The main Confederate forces surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, which is considered the formal end of the Civil War. The end of the war did not, by itself, mean the end of political instability in the U.S. Shortly after the declaration of victory, Lincoln was assassinated, succeeded by Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat loyal to the Union. His conciliatory policy towards the occupied Southern states was an irritant to the radical Republicans who dominated Congress. The Southern states gradually regained full membership in the Union through the process of Reconstruction, which concluded with an agreement between Northern and Southern politicians at the expense of the freed black slaves, who fell under a system of racial segregation. The American Civil War represents the bloodiest war in American history, if only American casualties are considered. It left behind long-lasting economic and demographic consequences, especially in the devastated South, which did not recover until the last quarter of the 20th century. On the other hand, the war finally established the U.S. as a true nation-state. Not only was the constitutional primacy of federal over state authorities established once and for all, but in a cultural sense, the U.S. became a unified space whose inhabitants considered themselves citizens of their own nation-state. The war also served to establish a whole series of administrative reforms and strengthen the role of the federal state in everyday life, bringing the U.S. to the same level as, or even surpassing, other modern states in the world at that time. For this reason, the American Civil War is often called the Second American Revolution. It was more than a clash of armies. It was a battle for the soul of a nation, between freedom and bondage, unity and division, progress and tradition. And though the guns fell silent in 1865, its echoes are still heard in the ongoing fight for equality and justice.